When most of us think about hydraulic drum heads, we think of that classic fat 70s, 80s tom sound. Really short sustain, big drum sounds, but like thumpy, really, really thumpy. So what is it that really makes hydraulic drum heads so special? Well, what's interesting about these is, unlike any other drum head out there, these actually have a layer of oil in between the plies of material. And that's actually the only drum head that features any kind of oil whatsoever between the plies. You may have seen other two-ply heads such as pinstripes or G2s or EC2s where you'll see a little bit of a rainbow effect. That's actually not oil between the plies, but more of an optical illusion that's created by both of the pieces of material acting kind of like a prism. And those are referred to as Newton's rings. So that's what's caused by light passing through those two pieces of translucent material. With actual hydraulic drum heads, you won't ever see, or rarely will you ever see, any of those rainbows because there's that actual oil between the plies that's preventing the two pieces of material from actually getting close enough to each other to create that prism effect. So what does the oil actually do when it comes to sound? Because of the oil between the plies, there's actually a disruption in the phase coherence between the two pieces of material. Now that sounds like a bunch of scientific physics mumbo jumbo, but for real, what's actually happening there is that the top ply and the bottom ply are unable to resonate together in sympathy. So you don't end up with as much resonance because they restrict each other's movement. That oil also acts as a muffling device by actually adding more mass to the drum head. So that's why you typically get a deeper, fatter, thuddier sound out of hydraulic drum heads, is because they actually weigh more. There's more mass there in the drum head. And if you look up close, usually on the blue and the red versions, you can very clearly see all these individual bubbles around the drum head, and that's those individual bits of oil gathered in different spots. It's oddly enough not as clear on the clear drum heads. You don't see usually multiple pockets. It tends to be either one or maybe two different spots where the oil has gathered. But rest assured, it's really still providing that same effect. Now, while you won't find any reference to this on the Evans Drumheads website, each of the configurations of the hydraulic drum heads actually feature different combinations of material. So you've got different thicknesses for each of the variations. Still, because they have that layer of oil in between, they all pretty much act the same. When you play a clear drum head versus a red one or a blue one or even the black ones, all the hydraulic drum heads sound relatively the same. And again, it's that deep, fat, thuddy sound that we've recognized as being kind of a classic rock, 70s, 80s sort of big tom sound. Now you can get a snare drum version of the hydraulic drum heads that has a light frost coating over the top of it, and that's great, particularly in my opinion, when you're using it and cranking it way high up there. If you're looking for like a pop or like a hip hop kind of snare drum sound, like really, really cranked, it's nice to have that coating on there to help suppress some of the overtones that actually start to become more apparent. Even though there's that oil between the plies, at the higher tension, those two pieces of material are vibrating so much faster that the oil doesn't have as much of an effect. Still, it does create a shorter sustain, so that's really nice when you're cranking it up there and you don't necessarily want to have any kind of additional muffling on the drum head. You don't want gels or anything like that. At the opposite end of the spectrum, it can be really cool to use a hydraulic drum head on a snare drum and tune it super low. Again, having that additional mass on there and the disruption between the two plies of the oil, you end up with a shorter sustained sound that's great for that big, fat snare drum sound. Of course, you don't necessarily need to have the coated version for either of these, and it's really up to your preference at the end of the day. Whatever sounds best for you is what's right. What we're gonna do today for the demo is actually take this blue drum head and put it on a snare drum, and we'll hear what the full kit sounds like with the clear, the red, the black, and the blue on the snare drum. So we've taken the blue hydraulic and put it on the snare drum and tuned it up into kind of like a medium-high range. And you'll notice that it's got a little bit of a boxy sound to it, and that's just kind of the characteristic of this drum head in this tuning range. Yeah, we could just reef it and crank it like way into the stratosphere, or leave it super low, like just above a wrinkle, or maybe even with a little bit of a wrinkle. By the way, if you haven't watched Daru Jones playing the hydraulic drum heads on his snare drum, he likes to tune them so low that there is a wrinkle on one side. And that close mic'd with a compressor on it, you just get this big, just like crunchy, fat snare drum sound that just really can't be replicated any other way. It doesn't matter what you're using. You can't put stuff on a drum. You can't tune it in a different way to get that sound. That's really just something you have to do by taking a heavy drum head, tuning it low, and getting it wrinkly. So now that we've got hydraulic heads on each of the drums, blue on the snare drum, clear on the high rack tom, red on the mid tom, and then a black on the floor tom, I think it's time to demo each of them independently. Then let's hear what they all sound like together. What I found works best with these in terms of a tuning is actually tuning the top head about anywhere from a second to a third below what the reso head is tuned to. The reason for that is that the resonant head, which is going to resonate far more than these batter heads, is going to carry the majority of the tone, where the control of the impact and the attack and just the fatness of overall drum sound is coming from the batter heads. So I prefer to leave them just a little bit lower than the resonant side. Now, of course, if you go on the forums and the message boards, you'll often find people ragging on hydraulic heads saying, "Man, why would you use those? They sound like hitting a cardboard box." And of course, just to prove that that's not really the case, we've got a cardboard box. What does this sound like when you hit it? That sounds like a cardboard box to me. So what are these drum heads good for? Generally, I'd recommend them if you're going to be playing in a small enclosed environment and you're not miking up the kit at all, and you just want to have fat, easy to obtain drum sounds where you don't really have to get finicky with the individual lugs and tuning, but you just want to be able to get a decent sound, especially out of a lower quality kit or a kit that has just not such great bearing edges to it. Conversely, you can certainly use these heads on a nicer kit, such as this Pearl Masters. I think that they sound best when everything is individually mic'd up and given a little bit of EQ and some compression just to be able to really pull that fatness out of the drum. It's important to mention that with the samples of these heads today, you're not hearing these with any kind of compression or EQ, and they're not close mic'd, so they're not necessarily going to pull out that depth and fatness of sound that you might be used to if you've heard these in recordings or if you've tried recording them yourself. These drum heads do not necessarily project very well, so if you're going to be playing in a live scenario, either you're going to want to be playing in a pretty small space or you're going to want to have everything mic'd up individually and being run through a front of house PA. These heads also thrive in the studio. If you're looking for fat, more dead kind of drum sounds, then these can be a great way to go. And you can actually still get a decent amount of tone out of them, especially when they're individually mic'd up and compressed just a little bit. At the same time, you might find that because they're not so versatile, they might not work for the drum set if that's your only kit for the entire session and you don't necessarily have time to change out the heads in the midst of recording. While all of the hydraulic drum heads behave relatively similarly because of that oil between the plies, my personal favorite, not just because of the appearance, but really because of the performance and sound, is the red hydraulic. I just feel like they have a wider tuning range and have just a little bit more tone to them, which is likely because of the use of two plies of the same type of material, both top and bottom. Still, you may not notice any difference, or you may decide that you have a different preference because there are different options to choose from. There's the clear, the blue, the red, and the black.